webinar on disaster consulting. We're so happy you could join us. I'm Diane Probert, and I'll be your moderator today, and we'll be monitoring questions you may have during the session. Before we open up the session, let's review a couple of key items. If you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. If you have audio difficulties or a telephone line goes dead during the call, please hang up and call back again to the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Feel free to ask questions or provide feedback via the chat box during the webinar. If you are using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for the option bar to appear, then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, but we'll work your questions or feedback into the presentation. If we can't get to your comment or question during the session, we'll be online afterwards to respond. You may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 24 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Again, questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout. We have one remaining webinar for 2015, which is on December 9th for abuse awareness and prevention. And on this website, showing on your screen, aspenrmg.com/heffinenwebinars.htm, is a list of all of the webinars. And again, we're pretty much finished for this year, but we are currently working on the 2016 webinar schedule. And we actually have 3 ready to go, and in an email that you receive later today, we will have information on how you can register for those. And those will be January 21st for top 10 ways to prevent employee lawsuits, January 26th for staying ergo healthy, Office Ergonomics 101, and February 23rd will be our workers' compensation update. And lastly, on the same web page will be all of the webinar materials discussed today. Just scroll all the way down to the bottom. You'll see webinar materials. Scroll all the way down, and you will see today's webinar. And then if you just click on the links, you will be able to get the presentation and a sample and a blank Word document for you as well, which our presenter will explain to you today. And with that, let's go ahead and turn over the screen to our presenter today. Kathy Marks is here with us today. Thank you for being with us today, Kathy. I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen over to you. And while I do that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Kathy. She is a principal and president of Aspen Risk Management Group and principal and vice president marketing of Ergo Healthy, a consulting firm that conducts office ergonomics assessments and solves ergonomic problems. Kathy is a health, safety, insurance, and risk management consultant who's also served in risk and safety management positions for a mid-sized company, and she has spent time on both the carrier and insurance agency broker side of business. Kathy is an experienced threat and risk assessment consultant for religious institutions, providing recommendations for target hardening of facilities. Kathy has a solid understanding in concepts, strategies, and applications of crime prevention through environmental design. She is a current and active member of the local chapter of ADL, Anti-Defamation League, Interagency Safety and Security Committee. Thank you very much for being with us today, Kathy.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you everyone for participating today. We have a good turnout, and I really appreciate you spending your time with us. You know, with any conversation on this topic, we can go in so many different directions, and so I hope that in the next 45 minutes to an hour you will find that you will get a few tools that you can use going forward, and certainly if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call me. I do understand that in light of the most recent events that happened in Paris, you know, our thoughts on crisis management and business continuity and disaster recovery really takes on a whole different light. And although I will proceed as planned, certainly I understand that as we turn into this kind of one world global event, that based on our business, what we do, we will have to look at crisis and disasters and emergencies very differently. So this, I want you to kind of picture, is a little walk down the mall. I'm going to show you a few stores that you might want to look at a little bit more deeply. We can certainly talk about different things, but I'm going to talk specifically about how do we understand what our threats are, How do we mitigate the threats that we have, i.e. get rid of what we can, and then build our emergency plans and our business recovery around those threats that we just cannot either mitigate, get rid of, or certainly lessen. So I hope that I will give you a few nuggets to walk away with, and I appreciate your time. I do apologize for my cold today, so I hope that you will, I don't, Diane, anticipate any coughing or anything like that, so we'll go forward. I do want to welcome all of you. You're here on the call because you're thinking about business continuity and disasters. Quoting a colleague of mine, we are all paid paranoids, and that's okay with me because our job as safety professionals, risk managers, HR professionals, presidents, CEOs of companies, we are paid in some degree to be paranoid, and we have to look at the world a little bit differently than everybody else. And of course, if I look at my second slide before I go forward, I do want to make sure that certainly everything that we talk about, it's a fluid situation, and please know that, again, there's no client relationship established between us and all of you, but again, it's just information for you to all go forward. I love quotes, and I think that this, in and of itself, with Winston Churchill from May 1935, right at the beginning of World War II. And his quote really rings true today. Want of foresight, unwillingness to act when action would be simple and effective, lack of clear thinking, confusion of counsel until the emergency comes, until self-preservation strikes its jarring gong. These are the features which constitute the endless repetition of history. I think we're going to this right now, but here are a couple things that I want you to think about. Are you looking ahead as risk managers, HR professionals, safety professionals? Are you looking ahead as to what can affect your business? And it can be anything from the drought, it can be anything from earthquakes, fracking, fires, anything that might affect your business. It may even be that you use a particular chemical in your industry and you will not be able to get access to it 3, 4, 5 years from now. It could be anything from terrorism to the inability to get a piece of equipment. Are you looking ahead? Are we acting now when it's appropriate? Are you putting budgets in place? Are you looking at staffing? Are you looking at contingency planning? Succession planning? Will you have the people in place to fill the roles that you need? Are we looking at programs in place? Are you looking at current events? If you remember nothing else from this presentation, I want you to take a pen and a paper and write this down right now. If you are not getting together either with your executive team, your safety committee, or your crisis disaster team right now and talking about current events, I want you to do that. Promise me that in 2016, when something happens with a similar industry of yours, or something happens at a school or a business, whether it's workplace violence, a fire, anything, I want you to get together, have a brown bag lunch, and talk about it. Could it happen here? What would we have done in that situation? Are we prepared if that event happened in our business? So again, please think, are you talking about learning from current events and lessons learned? So if you're not meeting, promise me that in 2016 that you will start getting together and talking about similar events. Don't wait until the emergency comes and then we act when we're just looking at self-preservation and we are not looking at it when it was simple and effective and when we were thinking clearly. So what have we done in the past? Well, typically, as organizations, when there's an emergency or a crisis, we just look at short-term gains. We have social pressure. We have risky behavior because, well, nothing's ever happened before, so we're not going to think about it. We're not going to think about sprinklering our building. We're not going to think about disaster planning when it comes to a fire, and what are we going to do with our off-site business when our building burns down. So sometimes, and the great book that I got several years ago called Flirting with Disaster, Mark Gerstein says, it doesn't appear to matter whether the consequences affect just us personally or impact the lives of thousands of strangers. We seem to typically put off clear decision making until we have no other choice but to respond in a disaster. So I am hoping that those of you that are on this call right now are on it because you want to think ahead. The world is changing, and the world is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. I'm going to replace those words social pressure with words like industry pressure, board of directors pressure, public scrutiny pressure, and social media. If you don't think that your company responds to social media, I want you to really think about that. It is amazing between Facebook and Instagram and all of the things that are going out like that. Our employees are communicating our companies, good, bad, indifferent, all our warts and all of our wrinkles on Facebook. Everything that we do absolutely is going out there to the public in very different ways, and we as risk managers and crisis management, we have to take into consideration what is going on out there in social media. Because at the end of the day, when we think about our job as a risk manager, as an HR director, as a president, CEO of a company, is we have a duty to prevent events that can cause harm to people, property, and the environment. And at the end of the day, to protect our companies, our city, our agency from financial harm. That's it. Every decision you make, whether it's today, planning ahead, business continuity, what departments you will start up in the first 2 days, 3 days, week, month in the event of a crisis, every one of those decisions is going to fall into one of these buckets. It affects people, property, our environment, and financially affects our company and may decide whether or not our company continues. So it's a good thing to think about. I want to talk just briefly about the power of citizen journalism. Leon Fearth was the National Security Advisor to Al Gore. He's currently a professor at George Washington University on international affairs. And his quote many years ago was really talking about the new face of emergent class of problems. It's fast-moving and unstable. As we are fighting these not necessarily literal fires, but when a crisis occurs, we know that within minutes, seconds, it's out on social media. We have the newspapers, radios interviewing our employees, the man on the street. From an OSHA perspective, as a safety professional, we know that who can call OSHA? Anybody. It could be that somebody driving by with a phone and thinking that somebody's acting unsafely. They can call OSHA. They can call the news media. And right or wrong, all of a sudden, the decision you make for your company is plastered out there and goes viral in a YouTube video, and you have absolutely no control over the situation. So what happens is, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, small events all of a sudden lead to massively consequential results. So that's why I go back to the very first thing I want you to promise me is that in 2016 you will create a group of managers, supervisors, and executives within your company that you will get together and discuss current events to make sure that you are planning ahead for what could happen in your organization. And Diane, I think I have my first polling question.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and launch that for the audience. And the first question is, do you think social media can impact a company's reputation? Yes, a lot. No, not at all. No one of substance pays attention to it. Or maybe some impact. We appreciate you all participating in our polls. It gives our presenter a guide on who's out there and what your opinions are. So thank you very much for choosing either yes, no, or maybe. And I'm going to go ahead and just give you a couple more seconds to get your answers in. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and close out and share the results with everyone. And it looks like, Kathy, 91% say yes, a lot. 9% say maybe, some impact. And no one chose no.
All right. You guys rock. I appreciate that. And I think that it's absolutely 91% of you, yes, a lot. And I'm going to give you an example of how social media has affected a company. I'm so glad that zero said no impact or some impact, and 9% said maybe. And it could depend on your organization as well. So I want to give you a little bit of a history and kind of lets us know where we've been and where we are. If we look at this, and this is a social media researcher from Scandinavia, and it goes kind of over the last few years, Thomas Bakedal, he looked at the changing crisis landscape. And when you look at this flow chart, he talks about certainly the 1800s all the way to 2010, and that's when he did his study, saying that where did we get our information from? Where did the average human being consumer get their information? Well, if you look at in the 1980s, and I'm going to talk about Tylenol in just a second, comparing it to today, 1980, it was newspapers, radio, television. There was no such thing as the internet. There was no such thing as social media. So there was a time lag that if something happened within an organization, companies had time to manage the crisis. We don't have time to manage the crisis anymore, because if you move over, and in his little square of 2010, some newspapers and radio and some television, but now look at it, websites, blogs, social networks, and social news. So a blog, anybody can do a blog, and it's interesting how we can all see which ones of our friends are kind of new to Facebook or new to email. They're passing along things that are totally untrue. A lot of people still believe if it's on the internet, it must be true. They can't put it on the internet if it's not true. We know, of course, that makes no sense whatsoever. So social media, because of just its nature, moves extremely fast. So I want to talk a little bit about 1982, when we got most of our information from the news media. Some of you may have been around, some of you may not have even been born yet. I understand that, but here's what's really important. In 1982, Tylenol it was one of the most successful over-the-counter medicines. Johnson & Johnson came out with it, and what happened was there was a group of individuals, and initially a 12-year-old girl died after taking Tylenol, and it was laced with 65 milligrams of cyanide. At the end of the day, 7 people in this Chicago neighborhood died. What was interesting is that the way Johnson & Johnson found out about it was from a newspaper reporter. Can you imagine if that happened now? But it was a newspaper reporter. And actually, it was a paramedic who found that as he kept responding to these 7 people in the same neighborhood, it was a paramedic who tied it to Tylenol. It wasn't even Johnson & Johnson. So what happened was, as soon as they found out, at that time, Tylenol controlled 37% of the market. It went down to 7%. They immediately recalled 31 million bottles at a loss of more than $100 million, and they halted all advertising. What they did was fascinating, actually. So from September 29th, 1982 to October 5th, what a period of 6-7 days, they issued a nationwide recall of Tylenol products. And what Johnson & Johnson did is that they followed their company credo that was developed in the 1950s when the company first started. And what they did was, I actually have a copy of it in front of me, and it's broken down into 4 paragraphs. The first one is people, that their first credo for this company says, we believe our first responsibility is to the doctors, nurses, and patients, to mothers and fathers, and all others who use our products. The second one is employees. We are responsible to our employees, the men and women who work with us and make our product. The third group of individuals they're responsible for is the communities in which they live and work. And the last people that they have a responsibility for, although of course it's in their credo, is their stockholders. People, employees, community, and stockholders. By following this credo, by not deviating from their company mission and not responding at the last minute to this crisis, they immediately, at their loss, recalled 31 million bottles. In November, 2 months later, they reintroduced the capsules in the new triple sealed package, which we use today. And because of the way they responded, they got their market share back, and now it's become again back the most popular over-the-counter analgesic. So they responded, they kept to their company mission statement, their company, but think about it. What would have happened to Tylenol if this happened today and it took them 2 months? When we look back in the 1980s, 2 months is like, oh my gosh, that was actually pretty fast. If you look at it today, it would be unbelievably slow. And now let's go to Susan Komen and Planned Parenthood. And this is not political. I know that a lot of things have happened since then, but I'm just using this as an example of crisis management and how social media and citizen journalism affected the decisions made of this company. Many of you may recall that in January 2012, Susan G. Komen decided not to fund Planned Parenthood. That was January 31st. And what happened was, if you look at the next slide, prior to January 31st, prior to this decision, there were average comments per post on their website, on their Facebook wall, 17 and a half, 52 likes per post, average likes on user comment, 1.7. Then when we call the crisis, it went from 17.5 comments per post to 5,500, and they weren't positive. The likes went down to 0.3. The average likes was 6.6, or comments or likes over user comments. And then even after they reversed their decision on February 3rd, just a few days later, still up at 4,000 average comments per post. It took them a very long time. This was not 2 months. This was 3 days. And that's how it affected. Now, if you look at the Twitter posts, you're looking at in January 31st, the comments made public. And then what you have is on February 2nd, you have the Managing Director of Community Health Programs, Molly Williams' resignation, because she really took the heat for this. And then the decision is reversed on the 3rd, 3 days later. And then, of course, we still had a resignation by Karen Handel, one of the senior executives, the 7th of February. But let's go back to February 2nd. Susan G. Komen's site was hacked, and it was hacked for a very short period of time, but this is the screen capture of that hacking. Help us run over poor women on our way to the bank. Now, no matter how you might feel about Susan G. Komen, this was a crisis in its making. So this was a quick hack. Someone got into their website, and the damage that it did for Susan G. Komen at that time was significant. Not only the image, their brand, their donations, and they have, I believe, recovered since then, but you can see in a 3-4 day period, not only did they get a lot of negative comments, but certainly their site was hacked. Now, I'm going to go from 2012 to 2013, and I found this to be absolutely fascinating, and that's why I love the fact that none of you believe that social media will affect your negative social media could affect your businesses. I attended what's called the corporate. It was a corporate directors forum. It was a breakfast, and it was how should the board prepare and respond to an emergency. I was actually sitting in the very front row at a table, and it was 7th of February 2013, not too long after Susan G. Komen, and there was an executive of a very large company here in San Diego, and I won't name the company and I won't name the individual, but I wrote this quote down on my napkin when someone asked him about social media. And this senior executive said out loud, "I don't pay too much attention to social media. This too shall pass." I am pretty sure the look on my face was absolutely in total shock that someone with a large, I think it was a biomed company here in San Diego, would make this kind of a comment. So just to let you know, social media will not pass. It absolutely rules our lives as business risk managers and disaster planners. All right. Diane, do we have any questions that have popped up? I'm going to take that as a no, and hopefully everything's going fine moving forward. So I want to talk a little bit about business continuity management as we talk about moving forward. There's business continuity management and planning. The management of business continuity are the first two phases when you're looking at business continuity. The first thing is, what are your exposures to internal and external threats? You won't know how to do a business continuity plan until you understand what are your threats, your hard targets, your soft targets, and you have to provide effective prevention and recovery efforts first. That's your business continuity management. The business continuity planning is what you're doing to prepare your organization during and through the disaster to keep your business moving. So the first things I want to talk about is business continuity management. So the first phase is, first you have to identify and mitigate the threats. What are your threats? And then go ahead and build your response plans around the threats that you actually have. So the third phase, as I said, is your actual recovery strategy. If you don't know what your threats are, one of the things you have to do is probably do a round table, and I'm going to give you some tools to do that so that you can do that yourself and mitigate or get rid of the threats that you can, and then you're going to build your concrete, your tactical approach, life safety, institutional business, and impact and property in your response phase. So when you take a look at this presentation, when you download it off the internet or when it's sent to you, here's what we talk about when we talk about disaster assessment mitigation. Here's the first thing you do, and I would recommend in 2016, when you go ahead and have your first roundtable, when you discuss your current events, talk about what's the difference between an emergency and a disaster. If we were face-to-face, I would say, hey, how many of you managed emergencies every day? And hopefully all of you will raise your hand, because an emergency, that's something you can recover from right away. It can be anything from somebody getting hurt to a small fire to whatever it is. But a disaster, that's going to take all of our efforts. You have to understand what are emergencies, what are our disasters. Then we have to understand what are our threats. We have natural, technological, human, and contingent exposures. Those are the events that may impact or overwhelm our organization. You have to identify in those four categories which ones of those are not emergencies but true disasters. And from there, what are we going to do to mitigate or eliminate, reduce those threats in order to build our, over in the red, disaster plan and response. So your first meeting, do the yellow, 3 points. What are those? I'm going to give you the tools in just a moment to look at those. The disaster planning and response, then you're building your concrete actions. You're developing your support tools. You're looking at your communications, your security, your fire, your rescue, all of those plans, your checklist. What do we do during that actual emergency? So first things first, recognize what can harm you and your organization. Remove what you can and build your plan about that. Develop recovery partnerships. Can your weaknesses be filled by another company's strengths? Do you have buses and vans that can transport your employees, but you don't have any place to put them? What if you partnered with a business that has a huge open up space where they do their employee meetings, and you can put a synergy partnership together with them and say, hey, look, in the event of a disaster and I need to bring my employees somewhere, can I transport them to you? And oh, by the way, I also have the ability to provide food, shelter, whatever that is, or water. I want you to look at your business partnerships and see who might be a recovery partner. I'm not talking about your cleanup crew or your IT department or a company that's going to come and help you. I'm talking about, is there another company that has a strength where you have a weakness? And then look at your long-term planning. So when we look at evaluating tools, there's qualitative and quantitative. So our qualitative is really the quality, deals with description. So when you're looking at your business, you're looking at the quality of your response in your business versus how many people you have, how many vehicles you have to take care of, how much inventory you have to have on point or in backup in order to continue your business. So it's the qualitative versus quantitative, and depends on how you look at things, you can certainly look at it. So I want to ask you right now, when we look at certainly the qualitative and quantitative, I'm going to talk about these 4 areas of risk. I already named 4 of them, but I want to see if anybody's paying attention. When I look at the 4 basic categories of risk, are they number 1, 2, 3, or 4? And Diane, you want to do the next polling question?
Sure. So there are 4 basic categories of business continuity risk factors. Name all 4. So go ahead and just choose the 4 that you believe it is. Is it human, contingent, technological, natural? Or is it financial, process, human, and natural? Or people, property, environmental, and cyber? Or contingent, safety, natural, and ISIS? So go ahead and choose the choice that you believe are the 4 basic categories. Can you give everyone just a couple more seconds to get your votes in for the first, second, third, or 4th choice? Thank you again for participating. I'm going to go ahead and close this out and share the results with everyone. And Kathy, it looks like 64% of the audience feels it's human, contingent, technological, and natural. 33% believe it's people, property, environmental, and cyber. And 3% say financial, process, human, and natural. And we had no one choose the last choice of contingent, safety, natural, and ISIS.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Diane. And you know, that's excellent. And actually, all your choices 1, 2, and 3, actually 2 and 3 can actually all fall into number 1. And so everyone's on the absolute right track. And I think that's great. So what I want to do is, these are the threat categories. So when we look at environmental, that can also be natural as we go forward. So when you look at your threat categories, I want you to think about the natural threats that can affect your organization. Fire, earthquake, wind, flood, El Niño's coming. Are you doing what you need to do to prevent or prepare for that event? We do a lot of work with municipalities and cities, and you know, I've been meeting with them and all of their public works. When was the last time your employees went over chainsaw safety, electrical safety, working at night, flagger training? We know for sure that a lot of the cities and the energy companies are going to be working at night, cutting down trees that hit power lines, everything else. Is there anything that your company right now needs to prepare for going forward with El Nino? Technological. What are the threats from a technological perspective? Cyber warfare, you know, the cyber attacks, the hacking into your website, the preparation and protection of your employee data, all of those things from a technological standpoint. If you have systems in place, you know, we now every once in a while hear about somebody, you know, in another country that can take over our vehicles through our OnStar program, or managing the controls of our water and the dosing of certain kind of chemicals. What kind of controls do you have from a technological perspective? Human. Workplace violence. again, hacking from within. What are the human threats that are we hiring the right people? Are we doing background checks? Are we asking people why they want to work in our industry? And are we truly, truly doing background checks? And the fourth one is contingent. And when I do these presentations, a lot of people don't think about their contingent threat. It's not you. You may have all of your ducks in a row as a company, but what's next door to you? Is Planned Parenthood right next door to you? Is a company, Airgas as an example, right next door to you with hundreds and thousands of compressed gas cylinders that can be used against you or can be used and sabotaged and you're affected by them? Are you next door to PETA, or are you next door to a company that does animal experiments? Do you have plans in place to make sure that you protect your company, your business, your continuity, your employees from contingent threats? Maybe it's just fire. Maybe it's just, a big power line that could fall over. What is your contingent threat? And this is the area that surprises a lot of people when it's something we haven't really thought about. So one of the things that you have is in one of your tools, and this is the sample. It is, I also gave you a blank one, and this is this is something that you can create. It's an idea that, just like anything, oh my gosh, where do we start? So the sample I gave you is when we look at threats, we're looking at kind of that natural. We're looking at the earthquakes, the winds, the rains, the floods. We're looking at kind of human, robbery, vandalism, weapon-related, equipment failures, technological, and contingent. Is there aircraft, watercraft, vehicles? Are you right by the 5 freeway where a tanker truck can fall over and affect your company's ability to do business? So what you do is kind of list everything. If it's applicable, yes. If it's not applicable, you probably wouldn't have listed it. And then the formula is, it's not showing on this particular slide, but you have it in your example. The formula is the probability. The probability is 1 is low, 2 is medium, 3 is high. Now, as a group, you all have to come up with an agreement what you consider as low probability, medium probability, and a high probability. Probability is could it happen? Could it actually happen to your company? And then you take the threat factor. And the threat factor is when you add together how fast could it happen to you? Will there be any forewarning, i.e. with an earthquake, there's no forewarning? And the duration, how long will it last, right? So you add that together, and then you multiply it times the impact. And the impact, again, is 1 low, 2 medium, and 3 high. In this case, when we look at an earthquake, the probability is a 2. Yeah, it's pretty close. The threat factor ended up being a 4 times 3, which is the impact. So basically then, probability times threat factor times the impact is the relative weight. And in this case, it's 24 compared to arson. All right, we've got things pretty well under control. That's a 12, and equipment failure was a 16. So in this example, all this is saying is that when we weight our threat, we definitely want to make sure that we have our rack storage in place, that we have our sprinkler systems in place, that we have our building retrofitted, because we know that an earthquake will absolutely affect our business. I've used this threat matrix in various organizations, as schools. As Diane said, I do a lot of religious institutions, and we do a lot of threat matrix. And sometimes we find that we have a lot of great target hardening, and one of our biggest threats is parents dropping their children off at Sunday school using their cell phones and driving these big SUVs, and everyone's going kind of haphazard, that our biggest threat was vehicles and not necessarily a bad guy. So I just want you to understand that when you look at this formula in your handouts, it'll make a lot more sense. But you all have to determine that probability factor, and then you weight it, and then you identify where do we start. And the next step is, of course, can we get rid of our earthquake hazard? No, but can we mitigate it? Can we strengthen our facility to make sure that that earthquake will not have as big of an impact? Same thing with robbery, same thing from a terrorist perspective. What can we do? Assault, guest behavior, all those things where we can restrict movement. What can we do to mitigate that threat to our organization? All right. So I know this can be a little bit complicated just in a conversation, so I wanted to make sure that I put this on the slide so that when you do look at it, it's a lot easier when you do your own threat matrix. So mitigation examples: eliminating the threat, investing money to control or reduce the threat. So let's say I have a robbery potential, so I increase my lighting. I put in access where somebody has to just use a buzzer to get in. I've increased cameras. I'm modifying my process to make it less threatening. I'm developing programs and protocols and procedures so that everybody is trained. I develop recovery partnerships. There's synergy. I've met with my community. I've invited the facilities managers of all my neighboring businesses, and we've sat in a lunchroom. I've spent, $40 on lunch, and we've talked about, hey, you know what? If something were to happen, what do you have that I don't have that I can make my business continuity stronger? Develop recovery partnerships. Have a synergy with some business around you to make it easier. And the last one is facility changes. Crime prevention through environmental design. I gave you a link right there. It's actually extremely fascinating. Crime prevention through environmental design is cost effective, and it's a way that you can make a difference extremely easy. The first principle is natural surveillance. See and be seen. The goal here is, what am I doing to have a crime less likely to be committed because I've increased lighting, I've cut back my landscape, no windows are being covered up. And the best example I like to use is the 7-Elevens. I kind of call them stop and robs because they have these beautiful big windows, but they're all covered up with what? Slurpee posters and hot dogs on a grill, but those windows are there for the cashier to see someone long before they get into the 7-Eleven so they can lock the door or press their panic button. But it's the seen and be seen. We've eliminated that natural surveillance. So if you have a receptionist, let her see who's coming into your facility well. The second concept is natural access control. It is utilizing walkways, fences, lighting to clearly guide people to your proper entrance. You can use planter boxes. You can use hedges. What you don't want is you don't want someone wandering your campus or wandering your facility trying to find the front door. You want to control that flow of people while decreasing the opportunity for crime. And then the last one is territorial reinforcement. It is really distinguishing what area is private, what area is public, and by signs and welcome signs. And that's why when you go into a retail store and you have these people that are in the store, hey, welcome to Target, welcome to wherever it is. What they're doing is they're letting you know that you're there and their eyes are on you. That's all total crime prevention. It's not necessarily the whole welcoming thing. They're letting you know that you're in their space and that you are being watched. And that's kind of the really cool areas of crime prevention. Overview. I know there's a lot more, but I just want to give you these tools. What we've accomplished: you now know what can harm you and your organization. You've done your threat and risk matrix. You've mitigated, you fixed what you could, and you began thinking about a possible response for those things you could not mitigate. And now you've developed and identified recovery partnerships. You've had your meetings with the facilities people and companies around you to share what you guys can do in the event of an emergency together. So now what you do is you want to plan your actual response. This is the red box. This is the actual response plan. So your emergency response guides the organization, what your key management does. You're preparing for business interruption. You're organizing your internal resources, and you're establishing your core functions. This is your evacuation plan. This is your bomb threat checklist. This is your lockdown procedures. What it doesn't do is tell your employees to do minute by minute. It doesn't prevent a disaster, and it doesn't guarantee anybody will absolutely be safe because emergencies are fluid. But what you've done is you've already done your target hardening. You've already done the things that you can. Now this is, what are we doing while the emergency takes place? Do we evacuate to the parking lot, Or if there's a bomb threat, do we evacuate to the store two blocks down? Do we lock down? Do we run, hide, fight? Do we shelter in place because the building next door to us is burning, or there is a protest outside and it's safer for us to be inside? That's what your emergency plan does. And this, I think, is really important. Your emergency and disaster plans have to be an all-hazard approach, because we don't know. Every disaster is fluid, and as things are happening, if we think about what happened in Paris on Friday, we had a huge venue where people were inside, kind of like a fishbowl. We had people outside in a soccer stadium. Of course, the bad guy never got inside. They blew themselves up before they got inside, but it was an outdoor venue. Then we had the restaurants where they were inside and outside. There is no way that you could plan for every single one of those, but in general, your emergency plan will have an alert and hazard. How do you know, or I'm sorry, alert and warning, how do you know there's an emergency, and how do you warn your staff? Is it a PA system? Is it a megaphone? Is it 3 blasts of an air horn? Now you've activated your plan, you're responding, you're doing what you need to do, you're looking at now the logistics, the finance, how we're gathering our data, who's going to interact with the media. We already know what social media can do. Just because you're the president of a company doesn't mean that they're the best person to stand in front of the media. And now we're coordinating with our first responders. One note to make: if you are not offering your facility as a training ground for your local law enforcement, I do recommend that you do that. They are always looking for new places to practice, and it's a great way for them to understand your facility. So if, God forbid, there is a disaster, they know your facility well. The other thing I recommend that you do is contact your community liaison in the police department and offer your facility as a clean place for that police officer in your community to stop by, use the restroom, get a cup of coffee, do the reports. It's always nice to have a police car in your parking lot at random times, and when you open up your facility as a place for them to have a safe place for them to do their reports, it's a win-win for everyone. And when you're organizing your response, really, somebody has to be in charge. Is it EH&S? Is it Human Resources? Is it the Vice President of Production? Whoever it is. People have to do things. Who's going to tell people what to do? You have to start looking beyond now, thinking about what comes next. That's the leadership, and that's the training that has to be done. And again, we're still in that red section. Don't forget, what about safety? Are you coordinating with other organizations and, of course, the media? And then the third phase is going from the human aspects to now the disaster has happened. We've already planned our business operations and the functionality now. How do we start up again? So the third phase is, what are our critical organizational functions that we have already established that have to come up in the first few hours, the first few days, the first weeks, the first month? So you're creating tools and forms. Now, you all know that business continuity planning can be, hours in and of itself, but this is in a nutshell. Critical business functions, your documents, your site support, and your overall strategy. What does that look like? You're integrating your strategy. You're restoring your core functions that you've already decided needed to start out. Does shipping and receiving have to start up in the first few days? No. But there might be your IT that has to start up in the first few hours. So you have to kind of identify what that is. If I look at the terminology, just to understand, your integrated strategy is your high-level business activities. Your functionality is who's going to start, your recovery processes, and your recovery time objectives, your tolerable down times. What can we do now? What can we do until we're permanently recovered? And what do we do, of course, as we recover our sites? Here's one thing to do. I've done this individually with departments. As you take one department, what's your recovery time objective? Okay, IT, how soon can you start up if your entire IT system burned down? What are the core business services and units that you work with, and what are the critical functions within that particular department. Because you may find, as you know, if you meet with every department, they're all going to say, oh no, we're critical to the organization. We must be the first ones that start up. And you know that's not true. So your business continuity planning has to identify what are their 3 or 4 critical business functions that must be up and what's their tolerable downtimes in order to get your business going again. Present a timeline, who's involved, what's expected. You've got your function, your crisis management team, your core services, HR, facilities, IT. In my mind, those are the critical functions. Now, it may be production, it may be storage for you depending on your company. Who needs to be up and running within 24 hours, 48 hours, 30 days, 12 months? That's your strategy. And once you do this structure for your plan, then you can build all your business continuity planning and implementation from this one simple chart. So what have we covered? Our mitigation, identifying what can hurt us and mitigating it. Once we've identified what we can't mitigate, we develop our disaster plans around it. And then the third thing is the disasters happened, we're all up, we dust ourselves off, and now we've got in a plan to say, okay, what are we going to do the first few days, the first few weeks, the first few months? So what do I want you to think about the next few steps? And then I'm just about done and I can take a few questions. I want you to complete the threat table with your leadership. I want you to take that threat matrix, identify the probabilities and your relative weights, and identify what can hurt you in the human, technological, natural contingent. It's going to be different for all companies. I want you to also establish your lessons learned from current event team. It's probably the same team that's going to come up with your threat table. Eliminate the risks if feasible. Implement crime prevention through environmental design. Build your response plans. Invite those facility managers in business areas around you, and then build your continuity of operations. And Diane, before we get to these polling questions, I also want to just talk a few things about a few things. What I want you to understand is that even those items that score low on the weight table doesn't mean they're not going to happen. It just gives you the opportunity to plan and take that low-hanging fruit, because eventually everything is probable, even the low probability catastrophic risks. So understand that everything eventually can be probable and that you will have to pay attention to them. Monitor them, making sure that you are aware, and make yourself heard. So Diane, if I can do this, I think there's kind of more golden nugget ideas. If I can ask these polling questions.
Absolutely.
So the first one is golden nugget ideas. Contingent threats is something I never thought of before. I will Google search my business neighbors as soon as I get off the phone. Number 2 is getting senior leadership together to complete the threat table may be a challenge, but I feel that I can communicate the importance. And the third one is I will go to the next meeting of Risk Insurance Managers Society, American Society of Safety Engineers, maybe it's the Independent Brokers Association, Building Owners and Managers Association, and begin working on synergy partnerships. This is more, it's less polling questions than, you know what, I know that I can do this. These are your next steps and the things to think about. And Diane, that's all I had today.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. We do have a question, and we also have a comment that I'd like to share with you. The comment comes from one of our attendees who wanted to let you know that, ironically, she was late in joining this presentation because her building had to be evacuated today.
Oh, no way. Oh my goodness. Hope everything's okay.
Yeah, that's what I said as well. And then the question that we have is there some sort of repository of best practices relating to business continuity management by industry?
Oh, that's a really good question. I have not seen it by industry, but here, if you are in an industry that has like an association, I would go there first to see whether or not there is a database within the association that, because chances are someone within your industry has already created some sort of a contingency plan. Um, there's the Business Continuity Planners Association, but I don't think that there's specifically a repository, but I would go to like a safety association or an association of their industry if it exists. It is amazing though, however, what's on the internet in a positive way. A lot of universities, because they are public or public industries, they'll post a lot of their information on the internet. So you may be able to find something similar to your industry that will give you ideas on how to proceed and go forward.
Well, thank you very much. And we have no further questions, so I want to thank our audience for being with us today, and I want to thank you, Kathy, for your presentation. It was very informative, and I wish everyone a safe and productive day and holiday season upcoming. Thank you very much for being with us, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.